everybody. It's Doug Woodward. It's great to have you joining me, and I'm really excited to be able to present to you the second episode of The Hot Seat. Today, I'm putting myself on the hot seat, and I'm going to talk about what might happen now that Donald Trump is not going to be, doesn't appear to be, reelected to a second term. So, let me share these thoughts with you and hope to get your reaction. And again, I'm here to make you think, not here necessarily to tell you what you should think. All right? Very good. Well, we evangelicals find ourselves at a true crossroads. Many of us are still believing that Trump will be president again, well, sooner or later, while others of us are ready to throw in the towel and just accept the fact that the powers that be put Joe Biden into the presidency, whether he really won the election or not. What we see when the turmoil is set forth and the events laid out end to end is that such hopes have been unapologetically dashed again and again by the deep state and the media. After the hope tied to each event was dashed, a proposed remedy quickly surfaced to refresh our hope. What we seem to be guilty of is something like the continual claim of date setters, that the second coming is just around the corner. When the anticipated date passes, another date is selected, and the beat goes on. Thus, what we have isn't really hope, but is, as Sean of SGT Report calls it, hopium. Is it time to put an end to the expectation of a triumphant Trump return? Most of us believed that Donald Trump was destined to be inaugurated a second time, and we would have him in office for another 4 years. Going into the election, it was obvious that the COVID-19 pandemic was a threat. Too much was being made of how Trump was mishandling the crisis. This was despite the fact that, in the final analysis, the vaccine was created in record time and should have been lauded by the press and political leaders. But this amazing, unprecedented accomplishment never satisfied Trump's critics. And those of us who study the history of vaccines question whether either of the two vaccines now being given to Americans were truly going to be an effective prophylactic measure. Never mind that it might be a sinister means to deliver some type of RFID microscopic chip into our bodies without our consent, so that we could each have our own personal tracking device, one that the state would use to track us and enforce what we can and can't buy. But still, whatever the verdict on the vaccines, the economy grew like never before COVID. This was real and helped hardworking Americans find decent paying jobs. And despite the much more recent lockdown and millions of jobs being destroyed by the pandemic, according to one poll, many Americans believe that they continue to be better off in 2020 than they were in 2012 before Obama's second term. This fact was swept under the rug by the media as well. And then there is the greatest foreign policy feat of the first 20 years of the 21st century. The 2020 peace treaty, completed in the Middle East, was a major accomplishment that many of us didn't expect. Jared Kushner turned out to be an effective envoy to bring about peace that no other full-time diplomat had done since Jimmy Carter and perhaps Bill Clinton. Initially, we thought he was nothing more than a dubious son-in-law and real estate speculator that had no business serving in any capacity in the White House. Boy, have those of us who doubted him been proven wrong. Kushner delivered. Of course, then we have the performance of Joe Biden. What did he do to get himself elected? Joe sat in his basement, hidden from sight and sound most of the time. His frailty and apparent dementia made his candidacy a wistful quest beyond his capacities. The poor guy stumbled over his words. His color was pale. He seldom gave interviews. And when he did appear for a speech, he was placed in front of a drive-in setup of cars, parked around him with honking horns instead of applause. We couldn't even tell if there were people in the cars. It was incredible. I mean, could this scenario be taken seriously for any presidential campaign? However, in the end, Biden generated over 10 million more votes than Obama, the consummate politician of our age, and 7 to 8 million more votes than President Trump, whose voting totals exceeded any other and all prior incumbent presidents. Despite all of these vital factors, Biden beat Trump handily. This appeared to be achieving mission impossible. Consequently, we all believed that saner heads would prevail. Common sense would surely alter the viewpoints of the liberal left. There was no way Biden's election could have happened without some major vote tampering. Evidence existed in spades. In Atlanta, we saw the videos of suitcases being pulled out from underneath tables where they were cloaked by long tablecloths, out of sight until all the Republican monitors left as directed by election officials. Obviously, the shenanigans were clearly caught on camera, plain for all to see. Next, we witnessed ballots being passed again and again through the voting machines. Watching this action in the video, surely it was obvious what was going on. Ding, another vote for Biden. Ding, another vote for Biden. The charade was endless. Then, out of the blue, there was the discovery that Italy and even the Vatican were stooges for NATO, enlisted by the military establishment in Europe to ensure that Trump, an obstacle to NATO since 2017, would be eliminated from the world scene. They, along with the intelligence services from several other nations, Germany and Great Britain to name but two, somehow intercepted voting data from America and sent it over the internet, which supposedly couldn't happen because the machines were not allowed to be on any network, or at least so the law demanded. After connections were established to the Dominion machines via hacking through nearby smart thermostats, the data stream was sent aloft. Some smart people, but primarily an IT professional, who later admitted and signed an affidavit that he was the guy who wrote the code and managed the process, pulled off a multi-nation election steal. These clandestine operators leveraged Italy's Leonardo satellite network and the untold fortune of the Vatican Bank to fund this massive, improbable fraud and make the automated ballot box stuffing a reality. Steve Pachinik, a former U.S. intelligence operative vital to the overthrow of the Soviet Union, as well as co-author of the Tom Clancy books, told the controversial Alex Jones a few days before it happened the Italian government was going to collapse because their prime minister got caught with his hands in the cookie jar. It was discovered he had been instrumental in assembling players to perform this huge act of espionage. He was one of many European leaders that hated Trump and his American first ways. Crispian Balmer, Gavin Jones, and Angelo Amante wrote on January 13 for U.S. News and World Report that, quote, Italy's former premier, Matteo Renzi, pulled his small party out of government on Wednesday, stripping the ruling coalition of its parliamentary majority and triggering political chaos, even as the nation battles a resurgent COVID-19, which had killed 80 million, the second highest number of fatalities in Europe. Indeed, within days, the Italian government collapsed, as Pachinik predicted. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte resigned effective January 26th. Furthermore, we apparently should ignore the fact that Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, had assembled hundreds of signed affidavits of poll workers from the swing states documenting how they had each witnessed personally voter fraud in various ways. And that was in addition to another notable attorney, Sidney Powell, who supplied substantial evidence that the Dominion voting machines could and were manipulated to award votes to Biden by a percentage of 1.3 votes for every vote Biden actually received, while allowing Trump a fraction of his real vote, 0.7 vote for every one vote he pulled, to be specific. This occurred at least in every major county within the 6 swing states. That is to say, specific counties where key metropolitan areas are located and in which Democrats typically outnumber Republicans. And despite perhaps as many as 80 specific court cases filed by Trump loyalists in response to the fraudulent voting in these states, no amount of this evidence would ever sway the state and federal courts because the courts just refused to hear the evidence. Systematically, they avoided being dragged into the politics of the presidential election by dismissing virtually all such cases filed by plaintiffs, by deciding in each and every case that the plaintiffs didn't have the necessary standing. Consequently, despite what the mainstream media reported and continues to report, this enormous cache of evidence never saw the light of day within the courtrooms of America. Putting it simply, the courts and the media stonewalled all attempts to place the evidence before the American public in an official forum. Consequently, attempts to reveal this evidence has been cataloged by all left-leaning pundits and several congressional rhinos as elaborate conspiracy theories without any grounds. Right. Nothing to see here. Move along. Nevertheless, as the new year began, hope continued to reign supreme. Many of us thought surely Vice President Mike Pence would stand with the majority of Republican voters as well as his senior colleague, President Donald Trump. He would refuse to certify the elector votes in the 6 swing states, since there were so many substantial questions raised by those who believed the election had been stolen. Indeed, there was precedent for Pence to take this action based on a prior event back in 1871, when many claimed widespread election fraud had in fact taken place. Nevertheless, when this business came before the joint houses of Congress on January 6th, Pence declined to exercise what many constitutional scholars argued was his duty. He would not give way to the recommendations of Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Pauley that the voting process in the swing states be investigated by Congress over a quick 10-day period from January 7th to 17th or thereabouts, in order to confirm that the results in these states were trustworthy and to quiet the anger of those voters feeling cheated. Despite these expectations and many worries voiced by the electorate, Pence demurred. We will never know whether Pence simply failed to have the necessary backbone or whether he genuinely believed it was best for the country for him not to intervene. Consequently, a final vote by Congress after only a few hours of debate was to reject the proposal of Cruz and Hawley. Congress ignored these 2 senators' recommendation for a congressional investigation to address the questions raised by the 75 million people who voted for Trump. With this final legal process defeated, many of us began to realize that the 2020 presidential election was settled. Trumpism was history. However, what I left out of this story was the so-called seditious insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. Over the 2 weeks before the 6th, President Trump had requested that 1 million of his supporters come to Washington to make their voices heard. They came just as he requested, and they were super enthusiastic. So, at the wishes of President Trump, this massive throng loyal to Trump faithfully turned up to hear his speech, leading to an eventual march on the Capitol. They were directed by Trump to protest peaceably. That is exactly what Trump said in his speech. However, while Trump was still speaking, a large group of protesters descended on the Capitol building. In fact, this throng went into the Capitol about 1 hour before Trump's speech was finished. The march in the Capitol hadn't even begun. Perhaps this didn't matter that the assault happened while Trump was still speaking. Perhaps it didn't matter that Trump had emphasized that the crowd be peaceful. Perhaps it didn't matter that the assault was well underway before Trump's loyal supporters began their march. And of course, the most pertinent point to make about this occurrence, it has been argued by the Democrats, the media, and a handful of rhinos that the Capitol assault was criminally incited by Trump. It was crowd psychology he put to use, revving up the emotions of the people so they would overwhelm the Capitol Police and break through the barriers that were at that time holding the crowd back. Obviously, it was spontaneous, right? Well, not according to the FBI. They had been tracking various groups that were planning just such an assault on the Capitol. In fact, according to Politico, a news source mostly unfavorable to Trump, and as published by the Washington Post, who had spewed hate towards Trump nonstop for 4 years to sell newspapers, there would be rogue groups using the crowd as cover to infiltrate and incite a riot. Quoting Politico, quote, "The day before the insurrection, an FBI field office in Virginia issued a warning that extremists were headed to the Capitol, according to an internal document reviewed by the Washington Post." End quote. I guess these warnings went unheeded. Oh, so maybe it wasn't Trump loyalists after all. Maybe the riot wasn't so spontaneous. And maybe, since Trump was still talking to the crowd an hour after the assault commenced, Trump should be cleared of inciting a riot. Wasn't it instead a false flag led by anti-Trump anarchists to make Trump supporters look like terrorists? Of course not, the liberal left replies. False flags don't happen. They are always just conspiracy theories. Well, but think about all of that. Don't the facts clear the president of any wrongdoing? Well, not according to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They have the president, now a private citizen, on trial in the Senate, which is slated to occur sometime in the days ahead. Indeed, in the days just before this post, Trump's impeachment was voted on and ratified by the House Majority Party, the lemmings we know as partisan House Democrats. Impeachment, the indictment, is now official and on the books, even though Trump has left office. Once again, in this case, constitutional scholars debate whether this action is even permitted by the Constitution. And, of course, the mainstream media won't connect the dots to exonerate Trump or challenge the impeachment process. And so the impeachment continues to be an item, even though it's already clear that the Senate will not reach the two-thirds vote necessary to convict Trump. What we have then in the corridors of American power is a show trial conducted for purely political reasons. But didn't President Biden make it clear he wants to unify the nation? He repeated this phrase several times in his inauguration speech. Consequently, perhaps putting the president on trial and the opinion of 75 million Trump voters wasn't part of his plan. Obviously, he could significantly calm the waters if he would voice his opposition to the impeachment. So perhaps predictably, although I remain gobsmacked by this outcome, we evangelicals who are conservative politically, and mostly wanting Trump to continue to preside as president, are now hearing from many a congressman and the media pundits that we folks should be considered terrorists just like Trump. Yep, oath keepers, libertarian thinkers, and even evangelical institutions generally should now be seen as hotbeds for anarchists and enemies of the state. To go yet one more tragic and uncalled for step further, today I heard from a friend that a bill is being introduced by several congressmen to officially make the United States a secular nation, ridding ourselves of references to God altogether. So who knows what types of sanctions and attacks await us? In God we trust? Well, maybe for we who call ourselves evangelicals, but obviously not for our country. Surely this cannot stand. Surely Trump is waiting in the wings to right the ship and send the true insurrectionists, those members of the deep state, to Guantanamo. And now we arrive at the last act in this play. It is now believed by a number of conservatives that what has actually happened is that President Donald Trump signed the Insurrection Act on the evening of January 9th. This would enable the military to take control of things, to investigate those guilty of insurrection and bring them to justice. There are several sources stating that this happened. Notable names in the alternative truth community are claiming that this is so. This includes Robert David Steele, a former CIA agent, Wayne Jett, author of The Fruits of Graft, as well as Charlie Ward and Simon Parks, bloggers who claim to have strong ties with insider information directly from the Trump team. Steve Pachinik's assertion that a military coup in favor of Trump and against Biden has been underway since the beginning of Trump's election in 2016. He's also cited supporting this view of the situation. Another popular voice frequently heard during this epoch is attorney Lin Wood. Along with Giuliani, Wood had argued many unsuccessful court cases on behalf of Trump. He too seems convinced that the military is now in control, and this will become evident in the next 2 months, sometime between March the 4th and April 15th. There is no way Trump would let this thing go. But various news sources that investigated this claim have found it to be false. First off, we should clarify exactly what is the Insurrection Act. According to one news source, Check Your Facts, we learn the Insurrection Act, which has been amended several times since 1807, gives the president the power to deploy the military within the U.S. to maintain order in some circumstances, according to NPR. The Insurrection Act was last invoked in 1992 to quell riots that erupted in Los Angeles after the acquittal of 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King. However, there is no evidence that Trump has invoked the act. Such a move would likely warrant widespread media coverage. However, Check Your Fact only found media reports debunking this claim. The list of presidential actions available on the White House website shows no record of Trump enabling the Insurrection Act. It seems that if Trump were to invoke it, he must make a public proclamation and tell all insurgents to cease and desist. The act states, quote, "Whenever the president considers it necessary to use the militia or the armed forces under this chapter, he shall by proclamation immediately order the insurgents or those obstructing the enforcement of the laws to disperse and retire peaceably to their abodes within a limited time." End quote. The opinion of Ward, Parks, Jett, and perhaps Steele is that the military is running its operations independent of President Biden. At this time, there is no commander-in-chief. Apparently, either the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Services are responsible for all military action. If this were the case, we could then say that there are currently 2 presidents. What adds fuel to this fire are numerous evangelical prophets predicting the Trump presidency will continue. A popularly acclaimed prophet, Kim Clement, who made this prophecy sometime around 2010, before his death, obviously, in November 2016, he predicted we were heading towards a time in which there would be 2 concurrent presidents. Clement predicted long before Trump ran for office that Trump would be elected president, and Clement is hardly alone. There are a slew of other self-proclaimed prophets echoing the same. Trump will serve 2 terms. As we bring this recounting of the story to a close, the failure of evangelical prophets seems to have become a major point of fallout. Popularly accredited prophets that claim Trump will serve a second term aren't willing to admit they were wrong, that Trump remains destined to return triumphantly in the weeks ahead. So what are the faithful to say, and what should we do? First, we should recognize that we were not wrong to hope that Donald Trump could rectify the wrongs in the deep state. There are many bad actors. We should always be hopeful that good will win out over evil. Wanting justice to be done is never wrong-headed. Trump promised this, and he did some things just as he planned. Secondly, we must recognize that Trump has never been our savior. At best, he brought a time in which middle America and the middle class had a chance to push back against the power players and elites that have been in control of our country for over a century, and especially since the beginning of the 21st century. He was a populist, but many of his ideas that he proposed during this time will likely have some impact on the political agendas of both the left and right in the years ahead. How much? Well, not a lot, but it is possible that party leaders will take note of what Trumpism was about and consider it in their policies, their plans, and programs. Will a new political party emerge? Perhaps, but it isn't likely that it will do any better than the Tea Party did. Thirdly, it isn't probable that the plight of the middle class will get much better. The elites aren't going to hand over control of the government to the people, and the poor, including the many non-citizens who have flooded into this country, quote, dreamers and all, end quote, will increase their influence since they have been made de facto citizens of this country, which will make it more difficult for middle America and the middle class to recover. Make no mistake, immigration hurts the middle class most. Fourthly, these outcomes will lead to greater instability. We know an economic reset is coming. We don't know at this time how this will be implemented or how soon it will be rolled out. It is not likely that this will make things better for the downtrodden. The moneyed elite control the game, and they are always standing to win. The golden rule in the secular world is simply this: he who has the gold makes the rules, and don't we know it? Fifthly, we should stop expecting a Trump comeback. Sure, the military might secretly be in control. Those that have explained why this is the case are crazy, just resisting the facts. But the cards are stacked against this taking place. We can't discern a military coup against Biden until some major military incident occurs to see how the event plays out and who gives the orders. In the sixth place, evangelicals are much too trusting of their prophets. Once their prophecies fail, it is unlikely that they were ever truly gifted by God to perform this function. We are too eager to acclaim prophets because we want new words from God. God has already spoken, and we need to know what he revealed. Exegesis is more valuable than claims to hear the voice of God. My final words: Trump will do what Trump will do. We can pray for him and wish him the best. We can still hold out a little bit of hope that the rumors about what might happen regarding Trump are true, that the Insurrection Act is in force and the military is on his side to bring him back. Such things could be true, but realistically, they aren't likely. Too many facts fly in the face of this possibility. It's better for us to accept the hard facts. It's best for us to return to political action in a traditional way. That is to say, we must work locally, build strength at the city and state level, get more involved in the election of our national congresspersons, fix the voting process at the state level, which is where the game is played, and especially support an independent press to educate the masses who have been brainwashed by the Mockingbird media for decades. Indeed, fake news remains an enemy of the people. But the free market can change this. Don't watch MSNBC, Fox, CNN, and the major networks. Find news sources that you can trust, like Newsmax, OAN, and other independent sources of news. You won't find conservative news on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube. You have to hunt and locate trustworthy services at their websites and look up other alternative streaming services like BitChute and Rumble. We can't expect big tech in Silicon Valley to do us any favors. This is just the reality of the present situation. But no, as we turn away from mainstream media, their advertisers will desert them, and their advertising dollars will continue to drop. Ratings will plummet, and media will have to return to a more balanced view of the world. Only then should we patronize them. So, it's your duty to encourage your friends to stop supporting the fake news, and make it clear to the purveyors of fake news, by your comments online and via mail, you aren't watching and won't watch them until they change their tune. This process requires some effort, and it won't be quick, but it is the right way forward. And insist to those caught up in their frustration and anger that violence and civil war are not the path we should pursue. Most revolutions don't work. It's the peasants who get squashed. So, let's support one another, stay positive, and work through the system even though it is not supportive of us. And remember, our true home is heaven, and our true Savior is coming very soon.